Greetings all, and welcome to the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. My name is Lisa Making, and I'm the Executive Director. In the spirit of reconciliation, we respectfully acknowledge that the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology is on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina Nation and Stoney Nakoda First Nation, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region. Our work takes place on land that is now known as Alberta. We gratefully recognize and honor Indigenous peoples' long-standing connections to these lands. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to this special presentation by someone with very strong ties to our organization, Dr. Emlyn Koster. Emlyn was director of the museum after our opening in 1986, where he not only led us through those busy first few years, but also helped guide our educational mandate before heading off in 1991 when he became CEO of the Ontario Science Centre. After that, he led the Liberty Science Centre in New Jersey, followed by North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Among many other honors, he is also a former board chair of the Geological Association of Canada, Humanitarian of the Year by the American Conference on Diversity, and in 2019, Alumni of Excellence Award honoree of the Faculty of Science at the University of Ottawa. With an established background in both geological sciences and museology, Emlyn's most recent work has focused on advocating for the concept of the Anthropocene, not only as a recognized geological epoch, but as a powerful means by which to illustrate the effects of human disruptions to Earth's systems. He has always been a strong advocate for museums serving as agents for educating the public about the climate crisis. His work in these capacities has been acknowledged by the United Nations following its Paris Agreement, where he served as a panelist for a stakeholder forum discussing Goal 15, Life on Land, one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Emlyn Koster.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and it's a great pleasure to be back at this place. 30-some years since I was in this auditorium for the last time, but I've been back since leading members' excursions from the museums in the United States. Thank you for your interest in this subject, not strictly in the paleontological realm, but rather taking a look at how the intersection between geological history, Earth history, 4.6 billion years, and human history, going back several 100,000 years, are not in a very happy conjunction these days. And I'll be unraveling that, particularly with reference to developments over the last 100 years. On this opening slide here, the atmosphere, the wafer-thin atmosphere, is chosen as a bit of an icon because, after all, the state of the climate, of extreme weather, of rising sea level due to warming, are major issues that we don't seem to be contending with very well. At least so much of the world doesn't really grasp what's going on. So I hope to shed, some light on that. So per Lisa's introduction, I've had the privilege of being at the helm of 4 major museums after I left here, went east to the Ontario Science Centre, and the missions of these institutions is in front of you, and then on stateside. And I have all sort of continued to focus on sort of the state of the world through the issues I just briefly introduced. And there in the middle of these 4 appointments, bracketed by 2 natural science museums, are 2 science centres. And in between, as Lisa said, I was elected president on the 50th anniversary of the Geological Association of Canada, and my presidential address in Ottawa, the city of my immigration from England in 1971, was the human journey and the evolving museum. My museological beginning is kind of laced in with my opportunity to work in 3 World Heritage Sites. The 2 on the right directly tied to my appointment here, obviously in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And I was remembering when I was in the park again on Monday, I was giving a lecture one evening in the campground, and this very avid tourist came up to me, and looking around at the Badlands at sunset, he said, "Boy, you paleontologists do a sure lot of digging around here, didn't you?" Not really understanding, as so many don't, that it's all tied to erosion by another agent in the aftermath of the Ice Age. But it was through the museum here that I got to go to the Gobi Desert in the '87 expedition, and my PhD was in Yukon Territory in Chronology National Park. So let me move on and talk a little bit about the changing impression of what geology is. When I was an undergraduate in geology at University of Sheffield, geology was simply defined as the scientific study of the earth. Geo, the earth, logos, the scientific study of. And it was pretty much directed to the solid earth, as in the upper left image here. Geologists weren't too much interested in what's underneath the sea, and they certainly weren't interested in the other encircling subsystems of the Earth system. But gradually, geology sort of became more earth science as we peeled off the ocean and realized that major secrets lay in the plate tectonics and seafloor spreading that underlay the oceans themselves. And then in the 1970s, we begin to sort of see, somewhat through the Gaia hypothesis and other hypotheses at the time, that the whole Earth system operates, as it says here, as a self-regulating series of ecosystems composing the single huge ecosystem that surrounds the Earth's surface at, above, and just below. But more recently, and very recently, we now recognize that at least there are 6 encircling, enveloping subsystems that really sort of make up the solid Earth of the former definition. And these are just schematically illustrated on the right. I'll come back to this later on. The little drawings in the middle, or in the bottom 3, are the tundra and the soil and the virosphere, the encircling sort of sphere or the enclosure of viral diseases. And so all of Earth history that we typically talk about is, and particularly in this museum, after you go past the Precambrian, Cambrian boundary, is of the Phanerozoic, which is the last 550-odd million years. And so this diagram takes you from your left to your right through sort of that sort of mega division of Earth history. And so just like us in our history now, we talk about, seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, years, decades, millennia. Well, geologists, also divide the time, only the divisions of time are, of course, much longer between epochs and periods and ages and eras and eons. And so it's just another frame of reference of a greatly magnified scale. That drawing in the middle is just sort of a vertical layer cake, as if you're looking at something like the edge of the Grand Canyon, in which the human layer is right at the top and the Cambrian and the Precambrian boundaries down the bottom, and you have schematic representation of principal life forms down the column. But I'm going to be talking about, as I mentioned already, the 100-year period starting in 1950, which happens to be a key date in terms of realization of what may lie ahead for scientific study of the Earth from space. It also happens to be the year I was born, 1950. I was born in the Suez Canal zone in Egypt, and I'm going to take you through to 2050. So a minute sliver, less than a nanosecond of Earth history, but which is a key period for what we're talking about. So 1950 starts with an astronomer, a British astronomer by the name of Sir Frederick Hoyle, who had done a series of lectures for the BBC radio. You see him there in front of a microphone for the BBC. And this book, he put his lectures into a book called The Earth in Space. And in the first chapter, which is entitled The Earth and Nearby Space, he does something that's pretty abnormal from an astronomical consideration. He gives this quote in the middle, which is really a phenomenally prescient quote for someone to have. This is 73 years ago only. And here he is saying that once a photograph of the Earth is taken from the outside, that new ideas as important as any in history will be let loose. The part of the quote that's often not included, because it doesn't really count astronomically, but is, in terms of human history, is frightfully important. And that is, he added, as you can see, that, and I think that this not so distant development, of course it would happen only 19 years later with Apollo to the moon, and this not so distant development, as it may well be for good, as it must increasingly have the effect of exposing the futility of nationalistic strife, which after all is one of the most dominant sort of flavors of human history today. And so there's the so-called blue marble shot, although that was actually taken by Apollo 17 in 1972, but for the purpose here we'll include it in this view of North America with the wafer-thin atmosphere, the swirling atmosphere. And then 1 year after Apollo to the moon, when they said one giant leap for humankind, there's a picture of Park Avenue in New York City with the first Earth Day celebration on April 20th, 1970. So that's sort of a condensed look at just a first sort of slice of this 100-year period that I'm going to be taking you on. And these slides are arranged chronologically, so you've got a tracker of the date in the upper left-hand corner. Let's go to 85. So we're now 16 years on from Fred Hoyle's revolutionary thought about what will happen in the future. So we've now gone to space, and we've had Earth Day, and now we've got the United Nations becoming concerned, or at least interested, in what lay ahead for the environment. And they had this major commission that was headed by the former Prime Minister of Norway, Madame Brundtland, called the Brundtland Commission. Some of you may remember this. And there's the book called Our Common Future. So this is a project of the United Nations in 1985. And this is where the term sustainable development comes from, a term that's ended up becoming very loaded, and I will delve into that a bit more. Lisa and I were just talking before coming down here. You know, the word sustainability is used so variously, ranging from, you know, a sustainable organization is one that is doing what it needs to do in order to continue to survive. That's not what this sustainability talks about. This is talking about how do we maintain the viability of life on planet Earth. That's a whole different scale of sustainability thinking. And it's a loaded word, as you see on the right-hand side. Andy Revkin, who used to be a science reporter for the New York Times at Columbia University, he's just recently moved on from there, says that the word sustainability is one of the most overused and ill-defined words in conversations about the environment, because much of what we call sustainable, including the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they're not sustainable at all. If we've already got rid of a whole chunk of biosphere, then we obviously haven't acted sustainably. And we can't say that we're doing the right thing for sea level, which is continuing to go up as a result of the transfer of H2O from glaciers and ice sheets back into the ocean. So we'll talk more about this. So I'm going to, again, continuing the chronology, and I'm picking moments to sort of give you this evolving flavor of thinking in science. A colleague of mine whom I knew, a physicist at the University of Toronto, Ursula Franklin, actually talked about citizen science in a book which I first came across when I was in the office of the director here. The Royal Society of Canada in 1990 published a book called Planet Under Stress. And in that book there was a chapter by Ursula Franklin, and she says this very prophetic quote, as you can see: the task of the future is to build knowledge and understanding among and between citizens and scientists, so that the distinction between the two groups vanishes, so that both become citizen scientists potentially able to solve our problems together. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's not happening. Scientists and citizens rarely get together, and certainly there isn't a joint more than the sum of the parts force that is actually helping to do very much in terms of saving the planet. So you have activists like Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who is saying there's no leaders in the room, and you're damaging this planet for the generations that lie beyond your current sort of irresponsibility. So again, we'll come on to this. But this term Anthropocene gets coined in 2000, firstly in a paper between Paul Crutzen, who was a Nobel laureate who discovered the ozone layer. He was an atmospheric chemist, and a colleague who was a limnologist, a lake expert, Eugene Sturmer. So they published a paper in 2000, but maybe the most referenced one-page article that you see there in the slide in Nature, which is the world's leading and oldest, most multidisciplinary science journal, called The Geology of Mankind, in which Paul Crutzen says, quite correctly, the daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society. To guide society. Again, are we really doing that? Again, I'll come to this. Secondly, we need appropriate human behavior at all scales. I won't keep on critiquing these quotes as we go along, but you can make up your own mind as to whether you think these things are happening. And then we are still largely treading on terra incognita, the Latin, of course, for land unknown. Meanwhile, this term Anthropocene is styled like other epoch names in the Earth history. We're living in the Holocene. There's been the Pleistocene, there's been the Miocene, and the Oligocene, and so on. But anthropos, it refers to human and refers to sentience, the intelligence of this species, so we say. And scene is Latin, derived from the Greek, referring to an interval of time. So that's why these words are structured like this. Anthropocene, preferably not Anthropocene. Anthropocene is in the same family of words as anthropogenic, anthropology, anthropomorphic, and so we shouldn't pronounce it Anthropocene, which is often what's done in Britain. I have a criticism about that. So this is the genesis of this term, Anthropocene. And then we come to 2007 and a development that's pretty meaningful for places like the Royal Tyrrell Museum, although the namesake here, a French gentleman who became a key thinker about the scientific method, looking at zoology and botany and paleontology all at the same time. And this was commemorated in a conference that was held in Paris, as you see, in 2007, which was the 300th anniversary of the birth of Monsieur Buffon in France. And this was an incredible meeting. As you see, almost 100 institutions from 36 countries from all continents, and celebrating the contribution of Count de Buffon as a pioneering mind in the scientific study of the diversity of life. And so they formed a declaration, which I would urge this museum and all who work here to know about. They were citing, now what this is 15 years ago or so, what was important for the world to know about natural history institutions. And so in 2010, actually the year before, in 2009, the geological infrastructure in the world, led by the Geological Geological Society of London in England, formed an Anthropocene working group, because any time a new interval of time is proposed for the geological timescale, it has to be obviously intensely studied to lead to its potential definition and to ratify or not whether it makes its way into the formal geological timescale. So the first chair of this was this guy called Jan Zalasevic, who writes this paper in 2010 with other authors in the journal Environmental Science and Technology. And he's already saying, and the term is far from being defined, but he's already leaping ahead to say the Anthropocene represents a new phase in both humankind and of the Earth, where natural forces and human forces become intertwined, so that the future of one determines the fate of the other. So we're beginning to sort of get this thing nailed a little bit, but again, what exactly are we talking about is got lots of ground to cover. We're now in 2014, and you may have or you recognize this book on the left, written by Elizabeth Colbert, not a scientist, but a reporter, a journalist, who puts together the evidence for an unnatural history. A very incredible book called The Sixth Extinction, the premise being that the previous 5 in Earth history have all been created as a result of natural forces, and here we are, Homo sapiens, us, humans, causing the 6th extinction. This book was marked in the New York Times by this rather incredible graphic looking at the percent disappearance due to human factors of, as you see, mammals on the right, 25% gone extinct already, birds, 13% gone extinct, and 41% of amphibia gone extinct. These are old numbers. These numbers have crept up, I'm sure in all cases, by a few percentage points. So this is habitat invasion, this is paving over, this is reducing wild spaces, all the other factors which hunting, overfishing, over this, over that. And so we're already, taking what nature evolved, and we're producing, a lot of damage. A couple of years on, let's go to a joint study by the Rockefeller Foundation, one of the oldest foundations in the US, and the oldest medical journal called Lancet. And they produced this report in 2015 saying the same thing, that the health of the planet equals the health of human civilization and the state of natural systems on which it depends, that we can't separate ourselves usefully and productively from the natural world. And so the right-hand side of this slide is my addition to say that then and now, and more importantly going forward, we need to sort of have a new sense of empathy, deep identification with the rest of living things. It's not just a human-to-human construct, it's a human to non-human construct, as we see symbolically here by looking into the eye of an elephant, one of the most harmed animals due to poaching and ivory usage and so on, and really ultimately all life and all of the environment. We have to sort of act synergistically, attitudinally, and in terms of actions by linking all these realms into one total ecosystem, which is what it is, but we don't act and think that way. So let's go to the world of the UN now. The clock is creeping on. It's 2015, only 8 years ago. And I should say, just fast forward, right now in New York, yesterday and today, the UN is meeting to try and come to terms with just how bad the world of sustainable development goals has gone. You may have followed some of this. Here's the front cover of the report called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Here we go. Sustainable development. So this is a 15-year plan, and we're already halfway through it in 2023. But a key quote from that was issued by the UN General Assembly in the document that's pictured on the left, and let's read it. We resolve, very confidently, ambitiously, we resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And I've highlighted here because we're talking natural history, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. Well, I'm afraid this isn't happening, and was virtually dead on arrival. Criticisms came about very quickly, and this year, leading up to the midpoint and the current conference of the UN in New York, literally as we speak, is sort of casting major doubt. It's called a promise in peril, and it's in need of a rescue plan. These are words being used by the United Nations. So I don't really have time to get into why it's failed, except that but 17 sustainable development goals, which are pictured here in this very largely familiar diagram, they start off in the top left with more human-related, more cultural-related ambitions, and they end up going into more environment and more nature-related ones, and that actually signifies the order in which they were considered. These, as you may know, were preceded by the so-called Millennium Development Goals between 2000 and 2015, which was almost entirely about the human condition, about poverty and hunger. Not that those things aren't incredibly important, but what we realize more and more is that nature and culture need to function as a holistic oneness. And so this is sort of the plan that was. Here's one of the commentators acting pretty quickly, a Canadian who's now I think at Royal Roads University in British Columbia, but at that time was at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, who says the Anthropocene is a key theme in contemporary speculations about the meaning of the present and the possibilities of the future. How the Anthropocene is interpreted and who gets to invoke which framing of the new human age matters greatly for both the planet and for particular parts of humanity, which is sort of a subtle mention to more or less the global south, not the global north, and to the those that stand to lose the most because of invasions of lifestyle and commercialization and non-sustainable, quote, development. So that's a paper that I think stands the test of time. We're now 2017, and you have this distinguished scholar at the University of Oxford in the UK Yadvinder Mali, who says, irrespective of the process of formalization, the Anthropocene has spilled out of its natural sciences origins to become a cultural Zeitgeist. This German word Zeitgeist means the spirit of the time, and is increasingly used in other meanings as I am using it recently. A Zeitgeist is a catalyst for numerous cultural, philosophical, and political debates about how to understand and respond to human domination of the earth. You can see the language is getting stronger and stronger, and more pessimistic, and more holistic, and more frank. But again, we're really saying the right things, but we're not doing the right things. This line of thinking is not new at all. You may know of the phenomenal mind of Alexander von Humboldt, who was a German explorer back, 250 years ago or so. His dates are there. There he is, and a map of his route in his expedition from 1799 to 1804, Alexander von Humboldt's travels in the Americas. He particularly made observations in northern South America, and in a review that was only a few years ago in the journal Science by Stephen Jackson, a paper entitled Humboldt's Fusion of Science and Humanism, you can see where this is heading. Much like the earlier quote that I gave you, the Anthropocene discussion, he wrote, focuses attention on a fundamentally Humboldtian observation. After him, Humboldt. Humanity and nature are deeply intertwined. Nature would persist in the absence of humanity, but humanity cannot exist without nature. So we have this asymmetry that's, again, being candidly confronted. The same year, and this is the year before the pandemic, the word existential that we see being thrown around so often these days was mentioned as, was chosen by dictionary.com as its word of the year. Existential. It used to mean, if I felt existential pressure as an individual, I might go to my psychiatrist or my psychologist and say, I feel overwhelmed by the circumstances I'm trying to deal with. That's a form of existential, but the term in 2019 suddenly explodes into sort of major environmental and political issues. So the rise of autocracies, climate change, pandemics, and the like now are encompassing life on the planet. And so in their justification as its word of the year, as you see it, this word captures a sense of grappling with survival, literally and figuratively, of our planet, our loved ones, our ways of life. That's what the word is used. When you see it, that's what it should be used to mean. It also inspires us to ask big questions about who we are and what our purpose is in the face of our various challenges. And it reminds us that we can make choices about our lives and how we answer those questions. So that's sort of where the term existential fits into this. And our clock now is, 19 plus 50, 69 years since that prescient projection by Fred Hoyle, who said that once a photo of the Earth is taken from the outside, new ideas as important as any in history will be let loose. So I mean, this is a rapidly growing geological nanosecond of time in which things aren't going well. Now let's go to 2020, sort of symbolically a year of looking in hindsight, and you've just had in the world of scholarship, as the scientists in the room probably know, you've had a decision which was correct, I think, to sort of form a new umbrella body worldwide called the International Science Council that combined science and the humanities to sort of have this overarching, necessary, holistic look at the way things really are. And so the person in the lower left, Motoko Kotani, from a university in Japan, is the incoming vice president. And so I just wanted to quote her. She says this in a blog before the last climate convention. The next one's coming up in Abu Dhabi or in Dubai in a few months. But the last one, as you remember, was on the Red Sea coast. And she said, the greatest challenge is for basic science and society to transcend the invisible barriers and to co-create a new vision of the Earth-human system. We've now got that term in an integrated manner, but 2 years before, the International Science Council had said, for the first time in a relationship spanning 300,000 years, that, give or take a few tens of thousands of years, is approximately when the fossil record shows that Homo sapiens were beginning to become the only surviving, maybe not already then, but soon to become the only surviving species of the genus Homo, because we were around other species, which would have been an interesting time with other human-like animals. But so now we've got, instead of the planet shaping humans, humans are shaping the planet. This is another way of saying this is the definition of the Anthropocene. So this diagram I showed you quickly earlier, so now we've got Homo sapiens, as it says here, have impacted every shell of the Earth system. So with this iconic image on the left of a thumbprint on the planet Earth, that was the logo to mark an exhibition at the Deutsche Museum in Germany back around 2017 on the Anthropocene. But I'm sort of just reminding you of the sort of six-fold subdivision. So from the top going down, we have this atmosphere that we almost fly at the top of when we take a jet across North America or across the Atlantic. There's looking down on a cyclone, of which they seem to be more and more, going down into this pristine view of the hydrosphere, the oceanic sphere, going into the surface of the Earth with the cryosphere, the frozen sphere, not only visible ice sheets and glaciers, but the tundra, which is melting fast, the frozen soil across northern Asia and northern North America, which is also emitting a lot of carbon dioxide and is often not mentioned as its own cause of global warming beyond industrial heating and all the rest of it. Then we come down to the lower layer, the biosphere, which should be enough to include us, Homo sapiens, but it doesn't. We get to name our own circle called the humanosphere or the technosphere. And there is the inset of COVID, just to remind us that rattling around in the humanosphere is the virosphere, which is the layer of infectious and viral diseases. And then, of course, we haven't just stopped at the surface of the Earth. We go down to not only mine commodities in the Earth's surface, but also bury, hopefully to never see again, things like nuclear waste fuel. And then on top of all that is the critical layer of the pedosphere, which is the soil sphere. So, you know, these six major ones and their subsets are making what it says now, and this is not my phrase, a bit like the Buffon Declaration in 2007. I was at a meeting at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in 2012, and I was in a working group to form a declaration of that meeting, also of natural history settings, and we came up with this phrase that we are at a crucial, actually it said a critical at that time, but crucial is stronger than critical, a crucial moment in the continuity of time. Time is not stopping for the human problems that we've created, but we must recognize, and we don't adequately yet, that Homo sapiens have done a sort of a major job mucking around with what nature's legacy has been. This world map, we're talking so much about climate change and about extreme weather and both, heat waves and droughts and record precipitation and the results that causes, like in Libya last weekend. But ultimately, and not long really, the biggest problem in that we can move sideways to more tolerable climates, and there's a new book out called Nomad Century, which is exactly about that. There's going to be parts of northern Canada which are going to be, in her view, extensively occupied within a matter of the next century as we escape areas that we can no longer tolerate the climate of or the weather of. But the biggest thing, as this diagram shows, is the amount of population which is hugging the coast. So here you've got, if you can see it, you've got in the red dots are coastal megacities, and often they're within a meter or two of sea level. And likely the sea level is going to go up within a meter or so by the end of this 21st century. You've got major deltas in the green triangles, which are low-lying, susceptible areas to sea level rise. You've got showing small island developing states which are particularly vulnerable, and they have their own voice in the United Nations and so on. Islands that are less than 10 meters above sea level. So all of that is sort of the problem that surrounds us. And so you've got the actual, this is not going to happen in any time frame of humanity, but there are the scary numbers that, and Greenland and Antarctica have been ice-free in fairly recent geological history. But if they were to melt completely, the effects would be nothing less than catastrophic. So, so here's a picture of Manhattan, and I've had a role in working with the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance to try and bring sort of a geological perspective on the fact that, as this author says in the journal in 2020, like it or not, retreat from the coast has begun. The question left is whether it will be managed or chaotic. Well, keep on building walls, you know, at the waterfront is no way to manage the problem. But that's what's happening. Singapore is actively building a wall around the entire island of Singapore. But ultimately, we're going to have to relocate and learn from countries like Brazil and Australia, who actually, not for sea level rise reasons, but for geopolitical reasons, relocated their capitals to Brasilia and Canberra. But those represent examples of what at large is going to have to happen. So there's the cover of that book I mentioned, Nomad Century, How Climate Migration Will Reshape the World. And so I'm coming to the end of my chronology here, and I have some resulting comments to make. But here's Jürgen Renn, who heads up the Institute for History of Science in Germany, and back into the Anthropocene. In our period, he says, the grand challenges are encountered in their aftermath. They no longer concern the local fate of city-states, but all of global society under the conditions of the Anthropocene. We can no longer categorically segregate culture from nature, but must face the fact that these spheres are inescapably mingled. So here we come back to that same premise that we must sort of make headway with. I've talked in two time frames about defining the Anthropocene. Back in 2011, after the working group was just two years old, I said then in the journal Geoscientist, as you can see, I felt that geology uniquely brings big time and space perspectives to the planning role as planning table as an essential frame of reference. The Anthropocene represents geology's best chance, I thought, to take its rightful place as a core contributor to the harmonious, multidisciplinary pursuit of positive consequences in the world. And here I should mention that string of words, harmonious, multidisciplinary pursuit of positive consequences, is actually from Aristotle 3,000 years ago. He said that in Greece 3,000 years ago. He thought that the purpose of leadership was to do those things. But in 2022, with co-authors from Cambridge and London, in the journal Episodes, which is the flagship journal for the International Union of Geological Sciences, I wrote today, that's last year, it does not seem premature to conclude that the Anthropocene, with all that this term can usefully encompass, looms as the most consequential alteration in the course of history, going back again to Fred Hoyle, 1950, now 72 years before, saying that when we see our planet from space for the first time, new ideas as important as any in history will be let loose. So this is a diagram which we don't have to get the details of, but there's a timeline, as you can see across the top, from 1 million years ago on the left to 100 years ago on the right. With Oppenheimer recently being the blockbuster film, 1945, the atomic bomb. This museum ends its storyline out there about 100 feet away with the Holocene epoch. And the various events have happened during that period. It's the one that succeeds the Pleistocene epoch, which is the Ice Age. But if we drop down to the historical timeline, you can see that there are many things that are beginning to happen, both in terms of nature and culture. The advent of space travel, for example, of agriculture on the various exponential logarithmic timescale there from 10,000 years ago to 100 years ago. But the Anthropocene event, you can see in blue, is marked as being sort of an increasingly prevalent reality within the Holocene epoch. And so, in fact, right now, geologically, and I talked about this in my summary that you may remember, there, like every new term being proposed for the geological timescale, there's a process going on to resolve how to define it. And it goes through various stages, which I've mapped at the top. But the potential result, which I absolutely firmly, totally disagree with, and I'm part of a growing group, is that the Anthropocene Working Group wants to select the mid-20th century point between the 1940s and the 1960s, when we were testing atomic bombs and using them to kill hundreds of thousands of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, events which the film Oppenheimer recalls. This is not what we should be doing. Geology should not be using humanity's most heinous invention to name or to rationalize a geological term. What I prefer, and which I'm party to, is that the term should be, like in the previous slide, shorthand for the post-Ice Age accumulating, ongoing, major impact of Homo sapiens, us, humans, on causing impacts that have changed the natural processes that would be intrinsic to the planet. And that's the Anthropocene event proposal, which is what's figured here. And so, to sort of bring this to conclusion, the United Nations is a very controversial body. You know, I think we can all, maybe privately or publicly, say that, you know, we're not impressed. Well, it's got a hell of a job, hasn't it? It's the only body the world's ever invented to at least try to organize thinking on a whole worldwide basis. And it did so in 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals. It did so in 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals, so-called. But right now, it's saying these aren't going well. And so next year, a year from now, literally, is the Summit of the Future in New York, another meeting where they intend to try and look beyond 2030, multilateral solutions for a better tomorrow. Sounds very optimistic, doesn't it? But I'm proposing that the world of Sustainable Development Goals has not been successful. We've got to confront it. This is increasingly being said by commentators, and that really the Anthropocene is a necessary frame of reference as a zeitgeist, as I defined it earlier, to integrate culture and nature. And so I'm on Friday giving a keynote to the Alberta Museums Association conference in Calgary with a talk titled Consequential Relevance, in which I'm going to be talking around this reality that, as I write here, that museums are potentially many things to many people, but arguably in this increasingly troubled world, they should be proactively resourceful in consequentially relevant ways. This museum helps, obviously, millions of people, and tens of millions maybe in the decades it's existed so far, have an appreciation, maybe for the first time, that life has been evolving in complex and amazing ways over hundreds and thousands of millions of years. And not only that, but that this area is a key window into that geological, paleontological history, and moreover, that we all play a role in preserving the evidence that we need to increasingly understand and present to a public. It's our natural footing, if you will. So I think this is the penultimate couple of slides. We need to learn from the ways we've done this too late from indigenous people, particularly the Iroquois and the Dakota. Lisa acknowledged the indigenous lands on which this area occupies, but I don't have time to go into many of the traits which are very progressive of indigenous people. But all of us need to sort of learn these traits and think in these ways, being good ancestors with a multi-generation mindset. One of the slides I'm presenting on Friday, and I recommend this, it's a 15-minute TED Talk, the most watched TED Talk ever, by this guy Simon Sinek in 2009. And he basically says that it applies equally well to museums, which is why I'm talking about it on Friday. We need to ask of any objective that we have three questions, rhetorical. Why? Why are we doing this? Why are we thinking this way? What's useful about this fundamentally? Not until we've mentioned that should we talk about how are we going to do it. And only after we've asked how is what we're going to do in order to achieve the how to deliver on the why. It's a very elementary but phenomenal situation. They correspond, as you see here, to the act of thinking, to the act of acting, and the act of communicating. In business jargon, they correlate to having a vision, to having a strategy, and to having operations. But if I use the metaphor of going to the moon in '69, President Kennedy said in 1960 thereabouts, by the end of this decade, we're going to land a person on the moon. And if he hadn't said that, and he hadn't thought that going to the moon would prompt new insights around the Earth, I have to confess it was also about American supremacy in space. Let's put it out there. But obviously there was new technology to be invented, and ultimately maybe the most powerful, long-lasting impact of going to the moon is that we did see our planet from a distance for the first time. And so NASA had a job to do, and astronauts had a job to do. But you don't get to be an astronaut without a NASA, and you don't get to be NASA without having a vision of what is your purpose and why in the first place. That's why these three words are, I think, very powerful. And so museums, as I'll say on Friday, have not all the time been very visionary about these questions of why, how, and what. But we can take inspiration from some of the affiliated institutions, which we'll call zoos and aquaria, that zoos and aquaria, I think, give us, at least many of them, a pretty inspirational feeling for what might be involved if we think in this why, how, what way. As it says here, zoos used to be about barred cages with non-ecological settings. And it's not long ago that SeaWorlds used to have leaping killer whales. And you went to circuses with Bengal tigers leaping through flaming hoops. Thankfully, that doesn't happen anymore. But it happened for a long time, and it was wrong, morally, ethically wrong. And so museums have to find their equivalent of being consequentially relevant. So let's sort of move forward with the words of wisdom by some of the great biologists of the time. Rachel Carson in the 60s. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe around us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. Jane Goodall in Gombe in the 60s as a guest of Leakey, the great paleoanthropologist. Humans, she said, possess an innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. We do, but we don't act on them very much. And then the late Ed Wilson, to strive against odds on behalf of all life would be humanity at its most noble, he wrote. Well, children need to be born into this, and it's great to see all the families coming here. I'll just leave that up for a moment to just have you absorb some of the things. This I came across when I was confronted with the terrorism of the World Trade Center in 2001, because it was all happening across the Hudson River from where I was at Liberty Science Center. And I was very taken then, and I'm still very taken by these words of wisdom by the Marvin Wackerman Fund on educating today's children. We can't shelter children, I maintain, from the realities that surround us. Children can deal with these issues, and they've got to deal with them because they're inheriting, in many ways, the mess that the parental generation have left. So there's my final slide, with a bit of humor. The child is walking outside with his device, and the mother's saying, "See, this is called the outdoors." And the boy says, "Oh, yeah, I've seen this level in video games." The nature deficit syndrome is what we're talking about. The reality that we are detached from nature, that we're estranged from nature. So I'll leave that slide up, but that's my presentation for you. I thank you for listening, and I hope it's been useful or illuminating. Thank you.